Hi everybody, it's Peter Zullam's Griniflix Adventure 8 and welcome to an infrared, yes, black and white infrared video. I'm videoing in infrared. I'm filming with the GoPro 10 and I'm also filming black and white infrared photography. I've picked up a modified Nikon D800 with an infrared sensor, so it's been modified to give it that black and white infrared. The wavelength that the filter has been adjusted to is 820 nanometers. I've had the camera for about a year now and I haven't used it much, but I'm using it now and I've got a few lessons that I've learned along the way and I'm going to share that with you in this video. And I will do a combination of both cameras, so at least you'll be able to see what's going on. I'm also using my DJI mic, remote mic. So I've got my remote mic there, I've got just attached with the lapel. Alright, let's get on with the video. Alright, well I've had quite a few challenges with the infrared camera. Two main ones, which has been exposure, getting the right exposure, and also getting the focus. So then the third challenge is trying to work out which lenses are the most compatible with infrared or modified infrared sensor. So let's talk about each one of those. I started off using the automatic AF type lenses that are compatible with the Nikon D800. I couldn't nail the focus, put it that way. If I was using the optical viewfinder off the DSLR, then I would get the focus, but then when I take the shot, then it would be out of focus. Now, the infrared has a different wavelength, which also then affects the way it travels through the lens, which also then affects the way the light comes together on the sensor, which is also then affects the distance scale that you have on your focusing ring on the lens. I know from the old Nikon AI and the AIS lenses, there is an extra red dot on the lens, and it's the infrared dot. I've never had to use it because I've never done infrared photography, but that only resides on the old manual Nikon lenses. So when I was using the AF lenses, I was just missing the focus all the time. I could use the live view on the back of the screen, but then that was a challenge also because you know, in bright daylight like today, you can't really see the back screen on the camera. It's so dark. You can bring up the exposure of the back screen on the camera, but then you overexpose the image. So it's a real dilemma. Focus was a real issue. Getting the right exposure was a real issue. And the way I managed to do the exposure was look at the histogram on the back screen. So I couldn't really see the image, but on the histogram I could see roughly where most of the graph was, and if it was somewhere in between, or depending on the situation, a bit to the left or a bit to the right, anyway, experimenting, I could at least get the exposure. And then I'd adjust the exposure and then I'd take the photograph. Another big issue with the lenses is that depending on the lens, you get these hot spots within the lens. So you get, particularly in the center, it gets cloudy and overexposed compared to the peripheral of the lens, and I noticed that particularly with the telephoto AF lenses, or maybe even the wide angle. But anyway, this it was an element of experimenting to try and work out what works and what doesn't work. So what I've done is I've gone back to my old manual AIS lenses and experiment with those using that red dot on the lens. And let's have a closer look at that red dot on the lens. So I'm filming with the 24mm f2.8 Nikon AIS manual lens right now, vintage lens, and I'll have to use a GoPro, and we'll have a closer look at the setup that I have. I'll do a quick plug for Vamos electric bikes. This is the El Amigo. So this is my photography bike now, so whenever I'm riding around the harbour or doing my photo shoots, whatever, then I'm basically just using this setup, and it's fantastic. When I go for a ride around the harbour, I might do 20-30 kilometres. So before I was using my normal bike, which is great, get good exercise. But if I'm carrying some gear, as I am today filming this black and white infrared video, then it's nice to be able to just focus on getting to different locations quickly and then setting up and doing the photography. So that really helps. The bike's been outstanding. It's easy to ride. Everyone that tries it out, my friends, family, whatever, they love this bike. And having the pillion seat and the foot pegs at the back means you can even have someone riding on the back of your bike. All right, anyway, so Vamos is a sponsor of the channel, and I do have an affiliate code, Adventure 8, which you can use. So if you like this bike and you want to buy this bike, you can go to the Vamos website, and there'll be some details then. You use the Adventure 8 discount code and you get a whole bunch of accessories for free as part of the purchase. I have another discount code which is for another bike there, the foldable bike, which I've used for the Central Australia trip, and that has a different discount code because they've got different discounts associated with it. All right, a bit confusing, but anyway, it'll be in the video there, and that will make it all nice and clear. Well, let's have a closer look at the D800. This is a typical vintage Nikon AIS lens, 24mm f2.8. And if you have a closer look here, got the focusing ring here. There's a black dot and there's the white line, and you would normally focus optically by looking through the viewfinder. When you're shooting infrared with the different wavelengths going through and everything, it's got an infrared dot there. Can you see the little red dot? So that red dot now becomes the focus point instead of the black dot. So once you've focused optically through the viewfinder using the visible light, then you take a reading off the lens here, in which case here it is at 10 feet or 3 meters, and you just move that back to the red dot. Now the lens is tuned for infrared. Isn't that wonderful? I don't know any other manufacturer that has vintage lenses of any kind. I'm sure there is, but it was standard with the Nikon lenses, with the old Nikon AI lenses. Brilliant. I've got a whole bunch of these. 24mm is the widest one that I have of the AIS lens. I got the 35, the 50, I got the 135, and then I've got some of these old push-pull zooms as well. And they've also got an infrared line on there. So I'm going to experiment with all of these, because that gives me a fairly wide focal length, all the way from 24mm to 135mm. So depending on the scene that I have, I think that should give me good options as far as the type of photography I do. So I think that's a bit of a game changer, work using the infrared dot that's on these old vintage lenses. And then the histogram, I think, is the best way to do the exposure as well. So that solves the exposure issue using the back screen histogram. The focus is done optically through the viewfinder, and that way I'm not trying to focus through the back screen, and then adjusting for the red dot with these old AIS lenses. And so far I tested all the lenses that I have, these vintage lenses. None of them have hotspots, so they've obviously been designed differently to handle infrared compared to the more modern AF type lenses. Let's now take some shots. 24mm, I'm going to sort of ride around and try and find sort of angles and go through that process and take a whole bunch of shots. So the process I'll be doing, the histogram, using that to get the right exposure, and then I'll be focusing through the viewfinder. Once I take a reading of the focusing ring here, then I'll just move that back to line that up with the red dot, and then my focus point should be right for all my photographs. I'll just take photographs and we'll see, because again, it's very hard to review on the back of the screen. I'll only be able to review when I get back to my studio and have a look in Lightroom. So I guess I'll see you back at the studio and we'll go have a look at some of these photographs. So in Lightroom, and I've taken a bunch of photographs,
and I've done some edits, and I've also got some examples here as well. I'll be able to talk through the 3 points of trying to nail the focus, trying to get the right exposure, and also finding compatible lenses. So if you're setting up your camera for the first time with a modified infrared sensor, if you're shooting in color, then whenever you do a review on the back of the screen, you will see this sort of shot in red. So my advice is go into your settings and change your JPEG file, and probably the best version of the JPEG file is monochrome or black and white. And then if you do have options to make it high contrast, then it's going to be easier to see the image on the back of the screen if you're using live view, or when you're doing a review, instead of seeing these pink ready type images, you would see a fairly high contrast black and white image as well. And then if you're doing trying to get your exposure right and using the histogram, well then again it's going to be a bit easier to see in bright light. Let's look at the focusing challenge. I'm using the 24mm f2.8 lens, and it's the vintage Nikon AIS lens. So we look at the 2 shots here. The first shot here, you can see the number plate and it's slightly out of focus. Yes, the focus point is somewhere towards the back of the car here, when really I was trying to focus on the number plate. So the first shot was taken using my optical viewfinder on the Nikon D800, and then the second shot was taking the reading off the first shot, moving the focusing ring so that the distance that I had set up here lined up with the red dot on the lens. And then what happens is you get in focus. So that's the focus shift that you get shooting infrared using lenses that are designed for visual light. If you're using the live viewfinder at the back of the screen, well, you can actually refocus using that. So what you see on the back of the screen is actually what you get. So that's one way to get over this issue. So if you're using a mirrorless camera that has a modified sensor for infrared photography, well, then the electronic viewfinder, you'd be seeing exactly what you're actually focusing on. So it gets over that problem that you have with DSLR cameras where you're using an optical viewfinder. Talking about compatibility of lenses, here's an example of using my wide angle lens, my wide angle lens 18mm to 35mm zoom AFS lens. Yes, in this case here we had a really bright subject, a fireplace, and then it created all sort of halo rings around. It's interesting, so that was done at f16, so there's all sorts of diffraction that occurs within the lens. And then this was shot at wide open at f3.5, so there's a lot less of that diffraction going on. So whether that's just a peculiarity of the lens or whether it's got to do with something with infrared, I'm not entirely sure. But I did also try with a telephoto lens, and there's some shots here where I was shooting with the 70 to 200 f2.8 AFS lens, and shooting f9 in this case here, in most cases. And you can just see from the shot that the center is brighter than the surrounding area in a lot of these shots. But once you actually edit it, it actually that impact of that hotspot seems to disappear. Again, depending on the lens, you have to experiment. But if we look at this shot in more detail, it can be quite dramatic once you increase the contrast and clarity and haze reduction. When I saw this shot, visually I could see that there was quite a bit of light difference between the lit up area and the non-lit up area, but once you put into Lightroom you can exaggerate that effect and you have quite an interesting shot, in my opinion. I have a lot of fun with the editing of the file. So you can edit the raw file and you can keep it in color, or you can edit it and convert to black and white, and then change the contrast and the haze and everything. So there's a lot of flexibility that you can have. So in this case here, I've kept it as a color file and really didn't do too much. I did pick out the subject and just change the hue, and that gave me a different impact with regards to bringing some color into the raw file. So that's one option. Another example of that is here, where I've basically created a different hue for the bottom to the top as well. So you can experiment quite a bit, or you can just convert straight away into a black and white file, and then work with the black and white file and change all the settings here. You can see I've changed the highlights, the shadows, the whites, the blacks, the clarity, and you can create all sorts of impact as long as you get it in focus. So focus is the real key aspect, and as long as your exposure isn't too far off one way or the other, there seems to be a lot of latitude within the camera, well in this case here specifically the D800, and then you can still do quite a bit with regards to exposures, reduction, increase, whatever. And you can see from the histogram it's somewhere in the middle towards the left, again depending on the shot you're actually taking. Another example of out of focus, in focus are probably these two shots. Let's have a look at these. So if we have a look at a bit closer here, so this shot on the left was taken using the optical viewfinder and the DSLR D800, what I thought was in focus, and then knowing taking the second shot, once I worked out the distance on the focus ring, then adjusting it so that the red dot lined up, and you can see that I've managed to get the focus, whereas the previous one was back focusing. And then with the focus shift with infrared, bringing it back, I was able to get a better shot, and I was even able to get even a better shot using the live view on the back of the screen, on the back screen of the camera. Don't get the focus, you don't get the shot. And then having the histogram somewhere in the middle meant that you also had a good exposure. Let's finish off with a bit of a slideshow. Shooting black and white is fun. I really enjoy it. It requires, I think, a bit more effort, eliminating color. Shooting black and white infrared, I think, requires even more work, because you've got this issue with a focus shift because of infrared, and trying to get the right exposure, and then trying to guess what the end product's going to be like. Again, if you have a mirrorless camera, it's going to be a bit easier. But it really does test your creativity, both in taking the photograph, but then also later on when you're doing the edits within Lightroom. So enjoy the slideshow. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you have, give it a thumbs up. If it's the first time to my channel, if you haven't subscribed already, then do please subscribe. That's how you support the channel. If you need an electric bike, then visit vamosbikes.com.au. If you like one of those two bikes that are mentioned, and then use those discount codes and you'll get some accessories thrown in for free. Thanks again for watching. See you on the next video. Cheers.